I'm going to preface this with, I'm sure you guys have seen the Standard Hotel by now. This is not about the Standard Hotel, but it's very similar, so you'll kind of understand. Think about that hotel while I read. Located in the heart of Berlin, the Velvet Hotel was a modern luxury hotel that had every amenity I could hope for. The restaurant was classy, the service seemed to be top-notch, the price was right, and the rooms were gorgeous. It was also an exhibitionist's dream come true. The outside wall of each room was a giant window, the width and height of the room, and gave a great view of the city, and gave the city a great view of the rooms. While the host of the travel show I watched prattled on about admiring the city at night, all I could think about was having the people of Berlin admiring Felix and me. For weeks leading up to our wedding and honeymoon, I found myself constantly daydreaming about our weekend in the Velvet Hotel. I imagined all the things we could do and how many people would be watching us. I envisioned the crowd that would appear while we made love, our bed right next to the window. Or maybe Felix would take me from behind, fucking me hard while my breasts pressed against the cool glass of the windows. I'd get so lost in my fantasies that I'd end up getting horny while reading travel books or watching the dozens of Travel Channel programs I'd saved on our DVR. I constantly masturbated, my fingers idly playing with my pussy as I worked on planning our trip. Other times, I'd sit down at the computer with my vibrator and let it buzz deep inside my aching cunt while I looked at the hotel's website. The exterior photos exciting me more than any of the real porn my husband liked to bring home. I'd never been so turned on in my life, and it was all over a silly hotel. It excited me so much that I was in a constant state of arousal, and I feared my fiancé would grow suspicious. Luckily, Felix never found out about my travel porn, and I was able to keep secret our planned rendezvous at the Velvet Hotel. Though I did have to buy a few replacement travel guides, their tattered predecessors hidden in the bedside drawer where I kept my vibrators and lubes. When our wedding and subsequent honeymoon finally rolled around, I was more than ready to take off with my new husband. I still had to wait a few weeks to get to Berlin though, and I wasn't sure I could keep the secret much longer. After weeks of my fantasizing, we arrived. Our first stop was, of course, our hotel, and we were standing in front of the grand building. My husband couldn't stop staring up at the hundreds of windows, and neither could any of the passers-by on the street. Not a single person walked past without glancing up at the elaborate glass hotel, and my heart started racing as I imagined them looking up at those same windows once Felix and I were inside. What would they see? Would they stop and stare, or pretend they were unaffected and keep walking? I could feel my pussy tingling with each thought, and I knew I had to get my husband inside immediately and put my plan into action, or I'd come right there on the sidewalk. Felix was too surprised, too turned on, really, to help with the check-in. But the second I tipped the bellman and closed the door to our room, he was right there, pulling me into his arms and kissing me wildly. It appeared he was pleased. "What is this place?" he asked, his breathing ragged and his eyes shining with lust. "A hotel," I replied, doing my best to keep a straight face. "You know what? Never mind, I don't care," he said. And then he was pulling me to him again, attacking my mouth with his own. His kisses were hungry and demanding, and when his tongue begged permission to enter my mouth, I eagerly allowed it, my own tongue darting forward to welcome him. From the corner of my eye, I could see the light pouring into our third-floor room through the window, and it excited me even more. I became more aggressive, pulling Felix tight against my body and hooking a leg around his waist. I could feel his arousal through his pants, and I knew I had to get us over to the window before we wasted perfectly good sex on a private room. Dropping my leg from his waist, I started leading my husband away from the door and closer to the window. When we reached the bed, he broke our lip lock momentarily and started to turn toward it. But even though I knew the bed was, for the most part, visible from the street, I wanted to be right up against the glass. The thought of fucking him against the smooth surface, of being completely on display, had been making me wet for weeks on end, and I wasn't going to settle for anything less now that we were finally in my dream hotel. When we were standing right in front of the wall of glass, I held Felix's hand tightly and turned to stare out the window for a moment. The city really was beautiful, and I could see why people, even those who weren't exhibitionists, wanted to stay at the Velvet Hotel. Of course, when I looked down and saw dozens of people on the street in front of our hotel, all of them pausing to look up into the windows when they passed the spectacular building, I remembered why I wanted to stay there. Turning back to my husband, I said, "We're a bit overdressed for the afternoon's activities," and Felix immediately jumped into action and began tugging at my shirt and his pants, unsure of who to undress first. I laughed briefly at his excitement and then got to work helping him. unbuttoning his shirt and undoing his belt while he tried to remove my own clothing as quickly as possible. As shirts were torn off, I felt my pulse speed up a bit. When pants and shoes were kicked away a moment later, and our lips joined in a hot kiss, I felt my pussy start to throb, moisture already leaking out onto my thumb. And when panties and boxers were tossed aside, and we were both left standing naked in the window, I came. I had yet to touch or be touched, and while our kiss was passionate, it wasn't quite that heated. No, thought of all those tourists looking up and seeing me naked in the window, my husband standing in front of me, his cock erect, well, the thought had been too much for me. It set me off, making me moan in pleasure while my juices flooded my pussy in anticipation of the next step. Felix made the next move, and before I could look away from the glass, he'd pushed me against it. My breasts were flattened against the cool, smooth surface, and when I looked down, I could see several people looking back up at me. Or at least I told myself they were looking at me. It was hard to tell which window had captured their attention, and I was a bit distracted. I sighed as I stared down at them, and then Felix was pressing his body against mine, his stiff dick nestling between my ass cheeks as he kissed my neck, ran his hands up and down my body, eventually wrapping his arms around me and letting his hands wander down toward my pussy. When a finger brushed my wet pussy lips, I moaned and pressed my forehead against the window. My eyes closed tight. When I opened them, however, there were still people staring up at me. And this time, I was sure it was me they were watching, because the handful of people from a minute earlier were still there. And now they were joined by others, some of them pointing up at the window. "They're watching us," I breathlessly told Felix, and he mumbled something in my ear that sounded a lot like, "No, they're watching you."